John Cameron Grant was a naturalist, explorer, and anthropologist. In his book, The Ethiopian, or a Narrative of the Society of Human Leopards, he shares the proceedings and ceremonies of the Human Leopard Society that he observed in the 1870s in West Africa. His book was written in a popular narrative form, but every detail he describes is non-fiction. His claims and observations were corroborated by official records and accredited witnesses. We begin with Grant describing a Human Leopard Society group who are on their way to perform their grisly rites. Quoting from Grant: "Round a bend in the river, and coming swiftly down, appeared the foremost of a string of canoes. Great hollow logs they were, 20 to 30 feet long apiece, and manned by as savage and bestia-looking crews as ever peopled. Nightmare or rivercraft on the west coast of Africa in the year of our Lord 1876. Some 20 or 30 these crafts numbered in all, each holding from 16 to 25 men, great muscular Negroes, but of very low type. Many, who appeared to be slaves, were absolutely nude, but the others were arrayed in some kind of habiliment, from simple loincloth to padded, starched, and puffed-out cotton clothing. In one of the canoes, considerably larger than the rest, the whole of whose foremost paddlers were naked slaves, stretched in a space in the center, were 3 girls, fine specimens of the negress, also naked, apparently lying as they had been pitched into the vessel, and far too securely lashed to make any movement of themselves. Beyond them, towards the stern, were more slave paddlers, and then a group of priests, executioners, and 1 or 2 warriors, the latter carrying muskets nearly 6 feet long, made in Birmingham and called Long Danes, of which many hundreds of thousands were annually imported into the locality." End quote. This group then arrived at an island where there was an area cleared of all vegetation, the designated location for the ceremonies to come. Quote, "About the center of the clearing stood a withered solitary cottonwood, bedaubed from the bottom of its stem upwards with alternate bands of red and white. In the background, at the edge of the bush, rose another withered tree, upon which, apparently knowing what to expect, 1 or 2 vultures were lazily perched. As the foremost visitors approached, several large lizards scuttled from the rubbish at the bottom of the painted tree trunk and from under the hollow log drum which stood hard by upon 2 short posts. Several skulls, stuck on spikes planted in the ground, were scattered round it, with 1 or 2 wands, from which hung suspended a few disgusting fetish charms. To the foot of the sacrificial tree the 3 girls had been half dragged, half carried, and, being now flung beside it, all the company gathered about the spot. And now the horrid ceremonies commenced. I have no desire to shock the reader, but truth demands that I should picture cold-blooded, ghastly horrors. I do not do so without warning. The girls who had been gagged, in addition to being securely bound, now had the gags removed, their mouths forced open, their tongues seized with a pair of pincers, pulled out and cut off, and their cheeks slit back from the corners of their mouths almost to their ears. Some of their lashings were then unloosed, and they were reared one after another up against the tree and fastened to it by ropes, and by spikes of ironwood and bamboo driven through their hands and feet. Previously to being fixed in position, they had been smeared with honey, and now, after other nameless atrocities, each poor victim was pierced by a long, sharp slip of bamboo thrust from side to side. A few more slashes and indignities were inflicted upon the mute, writhing bodies, and then the spectators, priests and warriors, together, waited on by their slaves, sat down under their umbrellas, and while discussing the horrible sacrifices, drank palm wine and rum to intoxication. The ceremony just gone through was intended to propitiate the evil spirits that caused drought and bad crops. There, with their black bodies sharply defined against the red and white bands of the obi tree, hung the 3 girls, the crucified victims of the morning's rites. Crucified, that is to say, if such a barbarous doing to death can be called by the name of that classical form of execution. A steady stream of ants went and came up and down the trunk, attracted first, like the flies, by the honey dripping from the slips of bamboo thrust through the victims from side to side below the ribs, but now bearing away each its tiny portion of human flesh. Luckily for the poor girls, Their executioners had apparently desired to get as much excitement as possible out of their sacrifice in the shortest space of time, and hence the very brutality of their proceedings had been merciful. The victims had died shortly, very shortly, instead of lingering on for days, as is often the case with wretched beings crucified in more orthodox manner. The crucifixion of the girls was only the beginning of 3 days' terrible ceremony of murder and mutilation. The first day was over, and the town was now agog and en fete for the second day's entertainment, namely, the decapitation of slaves and the flinging off of their heads. Haphazard, to indicate the proper site for the new juju house that the king had been prevailed upon by the priestly section of his subjects to build to the glory of his father's gods. Suddenly, from the old juju house, came the sound of a single stroke upon the obi drum, and as its deep, peculiar tone reverberated through the place, the whole demeanor of the people changed. Men, women, and children rushed into their houses, and in a few seconds the streets. But now, from the direction of the juju house, which stood upon the outskirts of the clearing that surrounded the town in all directions in an irregular parallelogram, running back from the river some 400 yards, there came a crowd of priests, executioners, and warriors, driving amongst them some 30 or 40 slaves, men and women, naked and wretched, with their hands securely bound behind their backs. These traversed the otherwise silent and apparently deserted streets, and filing round the palace, which stood about the center of the collection of houses and hovels I have dignified with the name of town, passed out upon the opposite side, and took their way to a spot not far from the river bank, and close to the further or upstream edge of the open space. The procession halted near a medium-sized and freshly constructed grass hut on the edge of the forest, about 20 yards from which, and nearer to the town, stood a tall, newly peeled sapling, straight and stiff, but as flexible almost as a fly rod, and painted, like the sacrificial tree, in alternate rings of red and white. About 15 feet in front of this maypole-like object, and closer to the river, was what appeared to be a rude wooden chair, made by planting one long stake upright in the ground, but leaving about 4 or 5 feet projecting from the surface, thus forming the apex of an acute triangle, the base of which, about 18 inches distant, was formed by 2 smaller stakes, marking the 2 angles. These 3 uprights were joined by 3 short pieces of wood, lashed to them, and roughly forming a triangular seat. From the top of what I have likened to a maypole hung a short rope of plaited fiber, ending in a kind of stirrup or sling. As I have said, the crowd of guards and slaves halted in the neighborhood of the grass-built hut, and the victims, at a word from one of the priests, were made to squat in rows on one side of it. The term priest, by the way, is merely used for want of a better priestly office, among these people corresponding more nearly with that of a medicine man among the North American Indians than with anything of European origin. 1 or 2 muskets were now fired as signals, and at the reports a warrior, issuing from the king's palace, began to beat a war drum, whose rough, discordant notes had hardly banged and rolled in, answered to a dozen strokes before the entire population rushed into the streets, and wildly excited the whole gesticulating, laughing, rollicking stream of blackness poured towards the spot occupied by the. No sooner, however, had the mass of blacks been arranged in a great semicircle, with their backs towards the river and facing in upon the chair and sapling, than a dead silence fell upon them, not broken until the warriors in front leading, and the women behind clapping their hands in a monotonous beat and joining in every now and then in a quavering kind of chorus. A sort of chant was begun, varied with moans and exclamations that seemed to work them up to a frenzy of excitement and expectation. By this time all eyes were fixed upon the little straw hut, nor had they long to wait, for out of it suddenly dashed the chief executioner, naked but for a kind of kilt or broad girdle of leopard tails, charms, shells, feathers, and plaited streamers of grass, which rattled as he ran. His black skin was streaked and patched with blotches and lines of red and white, drawn probably in rude imitation of a human being, from whom the skin and flesh had been so stripped as to show white bones and tendons here, and there between the more ensanguined muscular portions. He rushed about the chair and pole, round and round, somewhat after the fashion of the figure of 8 in a high land reel, and then along the front of the people, moping, grinning, gesticulating, and brandishing in his right hand a long executioner's knife, with its brass handle and heavy conch shell, and shaking in the other a set of iron claws. Some of the women cried out loudly at his approach, and even many of the men averted their eyes, for there was no knowing what the maddened, excited creature might do, as on these occasions the executioner is sacred, and among the mass of the people may kill with impunity, and even with applause. Suddenly he stopped stone, still in front of the chair, dropped his arms to his side, and walking slowly back, disappeared in the hut. As he disappeared, a deep sigh, as if it were of relief, burst from the spectators, whose whole attention was now concentrated upon the priests, their attendants, and the wretched group of victims. One of these was shortly seized, brought up to the chair, and placed within it. A long coir rope, with a running noose at one end, was then placed round each ankle, and drawn tightly to the uprights, forming two of the legs of the chair. When this had been done, the ends were given to the willing hands of some of the spectators to hold. Similar ropes and nooses were then placed round the thighs of the victim, and the framework on which he sat, and others round his body and shoulders, and round the upright against which he was now braced. These were similarly drawn tight, and held secure. Lashed in this position, he was incapable of any movement. Presently one of the attendants, with a long hooked stick, caught the short cord and noose that hung from the top of the sapling, and drew it towards him. Whereafter, with the assistance of half a dozen men from the spectators, the pole itself was drawn down like a gigantic spring or fishing rod, and the double stirrup or sling at the end slipped over the victim's head, one part passing under his chin, and the other behind his ears. When these had been placed in position, the assistants carefully released their hold upon the sapling, or young tree, as perhaps it ought more properly to be called, and the wretched victim's head, without it being in his power to utter a sound, was strained almost to breaking point, in an upward direction from his body, leaving the neck clear. Now one of the priests began to beat a drum, and another to blow a horn and rattle a bunch of sticks and charms, while the people who held the cords, men and women too, drew them tighter still. Suddenly there was a yell from the grass hut, and the executioner, rushing forward, this time wearing upon his head a peculiarly fantastic headgear of charms and bones and other rubbish, mixed with dangling gold plates and grotesque masks of thin-beaten gold, danced in a frenzy before the victim, waving his arms, gesticulating, grunting, and exciting himself and the onlookers. Then, as suddenly, he stopped, and with a single stroke of his keen and heavy sword, decapitated the miserable. Released from the tension, the sapling sprang back, and in doing so, flung the poor wretch's head behind it, and away from the river, and up towards the outskirts of the forest, spurting blood as it went. Again the executioner disappeared in his hut, and the people who held the ropes, releasing their hold, tore the bleeding body from the chair, and flung it at the foot of the sapling with insult and nameless mutilation, cutting and hacking at it with their knives. In these proceedings the women were not less active than the men. Hardly had they given vent to their excitement than a fresh victim, this time a woman, was fastened in the sacrificial chair in the manner already described, and the sapling, having been drawn down and secured, as before, under the chin and back of the head, instantly stopped her feeble outcries. It should be said that these victims, unlike the girls crucified on the previous day, were not gagged or mutilated into quiet, and some of them sat awaiting their doom with a sullen silence that almost amounted to indifference. Once more the executioner rushed out. Again the ghastly performance was gone through. Again the released sapling flung its head to a distance, spurting the blood far and near, and again, with hideous mutilation and indignity, the victim's body was half dragged, half carried to the spot where its predecessor lay, and thrown upon it. Again and again was the scene repeated in all its ghastly details, the crowd becoming more and more excited as more and more of their number actually participated in the doing to death of their victims. The pile of bodies increased, the obscene and cruel fancies of their insulters growing as action lent exuberance to their imagination. At length, halting before one of his victims, instead of decapitating her, the executioner began a monotonous chant, in which the priests joined, exalting his prowess in head-cutting, and challenging any one of the spectators to rivalry, warning him and the crowd at the same time of the penalty in case of failure. As he chanted, a young warrior, mad with the sights he had witnessed and eager for distinction, stepped forward and signified his desire to show his skill. The executioner looked at him for a moment, then seized him by the arm and hurried him to his hut, whence the youth presently emerged, naked and daubed with paint, and carrying in his hand a heavy sword similar to that used by his mentor. The executioner himself did not appear. Trembling and frantic with excitement, the novice danced about, and finally, at a single blow, though not so cleanly as the old hand, severed the neck, when the head, as hitherto, flew through the air, to fall as before. A hoarse roar of approval rose from the crowd, and the rope holders grew almost frantic over their treatment of the body, till its bosom was finally hustled upon the rapidly growing heap beside the pole. The regular executioner now came forward, seized the lucky amateur by the elbow, and led him to his hut, alongside of which the latter squatted down, but hardly had he done so ere another victim was in place. And leaving the hut, the executioner once more performed his office so skillfully that the uproar of approval at his exhibition of deftness almost rivaled that which had just greeted the youth's maiden effort. Another victim was soon in place. Again a young warrior essayed his chance, and was successful, though the head, not completely severed, was in reality rather torn off by the elasticity of the spring pole than clean cut. At this, the crowd growled its disapproval, and the young man slunk back among them, safe, but in disgrace. Yet another victim was soon in the fatal chair, and the executioner, rushing wildly about, harangued all, without distinction of sex. Hardly had he ceased before a fine, burly negress, insane with excitement, sprang forward in answer, and claimed her right of trial. The executioner smiled grimly, and handing her a weapon, whose edge she was foolish enough not to test, or too elated to think of observing, retired to the door of his hut. The woman seemed for a moment almost to repent of the position in which she had placed herself, but only for an instant, for, after a frantic dance in front of the victim, she cut with all her strength at his neck. There was no question as to the vigor of the blow, but the direction was not correct, and though the stroke fell little short of severing the neck and left shoulder from the body, it did not cut through sufficiently to allow the sapling to act, the jerk nearly releasing the cords. Almost before an uninitiated spectator could have told what had happened, the executioner rushed forward, and, striking the woman's head from her body at a single cut, retired almost as rapidly as he had advanced. Straightway the whole crowd, with a roar of rage, fell upon the unskilful woman's carcass and that of her badly killed victim, now pitched from his seat, and hurried both with every indignity to the pile of corpses. But enough of what could be a monotonous repetition of horrors. Suffice it to say, that late in the day the people dispersed, the executioner disappeared into his hut. The priests, after holding consultation among the scattered heads, settled finally upon the site, and marked out the holes for the new juju house. Their slaves were set to dig, and afterwards to haul in the log pillars, and make other preparations for the morrow. Then, after the heads had been collected into a heap, and covered over, and the vultures had come down in clouds to gorge themselves at the corpse heap, the town settled down for a rest, to be followed during the earlier part of the night by a wild orgy of drinking and bestiality. End quote.